Good morning, everyone. Figured we'd do a morning talk today before our inboxes get out of control. So it's glad that you're able to join us this early. The Authors at Google program is proud to host Jonathan Spira today. He's going to discuss an issue very near and dear to us, that of information overload. Google's mission is to organize the world's information, but what many of the the public doesn't understand is that we're also there to make it universally accessible and useful. So we're in a constant battle against information overload, whether it's the relevance of our search results, the use of priority inbox in Gmail, or recent innovations like the Google Plus circles as a way of sharing information among friends. So Jonathan Spira today speaks to us about that in his new book about information overload. He is the CEO and chief analyst of Basics, which is a thought leader in the world of information overload. And his interests also extend to photography as well. He co-wrote a very influential book about the history of photography. Since this book is about information overload, I'll stop my introduction here. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan to Google.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, both here and in virtual. I'd like to first thank Cliff very much for inviting me to this. This is a topic near and dear to my heart, as I know to many people at Google and many people who use Google tools. It's simply, we think of information, it's kind of too much of a good thing. But first, before we start, and both for everyone here in the room and everyone watching virtually, how many of you here have smartphones with you? Everyone, almost, no? Really? Do you ever use a smartphone? Okay, cool, that's great. A lot of people are tethered to them. Could you just take them out and show me first? I'll hold mine up too. Could you, if you don't mind, and if you're in virtual land, just do the same with us, please. Sort of like the old TV shows where we used to connect the dots on the TV screen or something. Could you turn them off, by the way? While you have them out, just press that off button. I do that not because I don't want you to get any email or pay attention to that at all. More it's a question just to sort of point out the separation anxiety. When I do that in large physical crowds of people, when a lot of people are not attending virtually, if you saw the look of horror on some people's faces, especially in like really uptight business circles, they're like, what? You want me to turn this off, to disconnect? It's just, the fact that we can disconnect, the fact that some people don't even have smartphones is very refreshing to me. I actually don't get too much information over my smartphone. In the interest of disclosure, I try and keep that to a minimum. But it's interesting, when we think of information, one of the earliest ways we kept information was on a tablet. And it's just kind of ironic that things haven't really changed very much in terms of our use of tablets. I can't figure it out, but we just keep using tablets for information. Before I really get into this, though, I did bring a few friends of mine along to talk about the problem of information overload. So if you can listen to them for just a moment, I'd appreciate it.
Information overload basically slows me down because I'm interacting with information that's irrelevant, out of context. It's a scourge of modern day society. The reality of today is that it comes at you in such a high volume, you have to learn very quickly how to prioritize that information and filter out what's useful and what's not useful.
I feel my pulse quickening. I'm so engrossed in trying to deal with the emails that are coming in, the instant messages that are popping up on the screen, the phone calls coming in simultaneously. It's not a good feeling.
Sometimes it gets a little frustrating. If I don't check it, I almost feel like something's missing in my life. If I'm sitting with no TV on, no iPhone in my hand, and no computer in front of me, I kind of feel lonely.
There's no question that the amount of information I receive makes it harder for me to prioritize.
Well, as you can see, a lot of these people were completely broken up about the problem. So, never saw that happen before, but I want to cover a couple of things, and I also want to invite you to ask any questions as we go along. I am eminently interruptible. I don't mind interruptions. In fact, I'd love to hear questions so we are sort of contextual in wherever I am. Just, stop me, please. If I don't see you, just jump up a little more and stop me. But I'm going to cover some changes in how we work, how we look at information overload, what it is, and what we can do. One of the problems that I noticed, and just by background, I've been researching the problem of information overload indirectly for over 20 years. I've been studying how people work how people collaborate, share information, what people do with information, and you won't be surprised to know that we notice problems. There are things that get in the way. And ultimately, after studying and interviewing people and watching how people work, we found that information overload, and this goes back 15 years, was a significant problem. At the time, however, everyone was so giddy about the fact that we had email. It was just so easy to CC a couple of thousand extra colleagues. It was just so easy to share content and push it out to so many people that it really didn't matter. Nobody thought it was a significant problem. People actually thought I was kind of nuts for bringing it up because, oh no, don't be silly, just go back into your corner, do some more research. We have email, it's great, it's amazing. We can email the world. The ramifications of adding a few thousand extra people just weren't clear to them. And the way we view the workplace, a lot of people still have this sort of romantic and somewhat black and white notion of what the workplace and what the workforce really is. If you go back, at the turn of the last century, 90% of the workforce was manual and largely agrarian in nature. That's a huge change from today where a plurality of the workforce is comprised of knowledge workers, such as ourselves. Today, in fact, you have to really look for a manual workforce, and it's about 20%. Yes?
Sorry, is that US or is that international?
These figures, almost all the figures I will cite today are US. If I go out of a US figure, I will explicitly identify it as non-US or worldwide or EMEA. But thank you for mentioning that, yes. As of right now, I mean, there's just so much stuff we had in the US that I tend to stay with that. And a lot of the data we need, such as which I'll get into a little later, like Bureau of Labor Statistics and Census, just isn't as easily available worldwide. Today, as I mentioned, knowledge workers are plurality of the workforce, and that's even a stark contrast to 25 years ago where a majority of the workforce was comprised of industrial workers. And we saw the rise of information workers and information professionals, and this was foreshadowed in the cinema. One of my favorite movies relating to this, I don't know how many people here are familiar with the movie Desk Set. Okay, 2%, no. Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn movie, if you haven't seen it, it's actually very relevant to what I'm presuming most of us do. Spencer Tracy is a computer salesman for a very large technology company, and he is selling and installing, it's amazing, he can do everything in this film, he's selling and installing a large mainframe, you remember those, that will run the television network where Katharine Hepburn, who, just to show you, it was the 1950s, she was the chief librarian and her name was Bunny. You wouldn't quite see that happening in a film today. It's kind of, just wouldn't go over as well. But anyway, and they end up with a challenge. And the challenge, and I think this is particularly relevant at Google, is to answer a question. Now, if you think about it, today we still go to a search box, we type in a search query, we get search results. Sometimes, depending on how well we do it, and most people don't know really how to use the tools, you get 564,768 results. That's probably a typical number, although I'm sure you guys could tell me a more typical average number. And the question that they posed, the challenge question, as they say on some shows in television today, was what kind of car did the king of the Watusis drive? Now, needless to say, Spencer, it's not going to give away anything in the movie to say that the mainframe didn't do terribly well in answering this. And of course, Bunny and her team of librarians did. I promise that was not a spoiler. But it's interesting today, if you go to Google or any other tool and you just ask the same question, you're not going to get an answer, but you'll get referred back to the movie. So you still don't know that he drove a specially designed Pontiac. For those of you who remember the late lamented Pontiac brand. But that's kind of I've always found this a very interesting example. Now, going back to how we work, as you can see, the figure that's going up, that is abstract tasks. Routine tasks, you can see, are heading down and declining, and manual tasks, which declined dramatically through 1990, seem to have plateaued and continue at that sort of low level. So there's a tremendous amount of change in just the way we look at jobs and tasks. I mentioned already that knowledge workers comprise a plurality of the workforce. One of the things we found out when we surveyed Global 2000 companies, again, this probably won't be surprising to you, is that 80% of the companies we talked to, and pretty much all of the Global 2000, were simply not prepared for the types of changes we're talking about. Now, what do I mean by not prepared? It's not as if they're not using technology. They most certainly are using technology, but they're using a lot of technology, something I refer to as technology sprawl, which is kind of like urban sprawl. And they have so much technology that they simply get in trouble because they don't really know which system they're using when and for what and so on. So you end up with a lot of fun things happening, like, somebody uses one content management system to create something, and then of course because they don't use Google for search, they can't find stuff, and then somebody else recreates the entire project because they couldn't find it and they didn't know it was in content management system number 33. How many, I know content management is not a main thing at Google, but if you had a group of 1,000 employees, how many content management systems do you think would be reasonable for this small group of 1,000 employees? What's a reasonable number? Anyone? One? Yeah, one would be actually what I would think of. Yeah, one. How about 97? We're talking to a group at I'll just say a large semiconductor company, and we were helping them with some, we were incorporating some of their stuff into our research, and we had them do a little inventory, and they were as shocked as I was. 97. That's a lot. It's like for every 100 employees, we basically have a content management platform. Just can't imagine how they find things. So today, especially with the change in where we work and the type of work we do, and with 40% of the workforce working regularly, meaning two times more a week in non-traditional, non-Dilbertian environments, there's a lot of change underfoot. And we have, the rise of the knowledge worker. The knowledge worker, us again, I just want to throw out a definition from the book. The easy definition is what a knowledge worker is. I just say a knowledge worker is a participant in the knowledge economy. Then, of course, I have to define the knowledge economy, which is an economic environment where information and its manipulation are the commodity. And that's really a dramatic contrast to the industrial economy where you have raw goods. Now, keep in mind, at the end of the day, a lot of companies still build refrigerators, automobiles, washing machines, and so on. They build things, but the amount of information-intensive work that even goes into the creation of these things, and also into the manufacture. Think of robotics. I don't know if anyone has toured a car factory recently. If you go do the BMW tour, either in Munich or Spartanburg or Leipzig, you see all these robots, which in German they say Robot. People get confused about the Roberts who are doing all the work here. And they're doing all this stuff. It's like a ballet carefully choreographed. So they have to be controlled and managed. So the people on the floor who are managing them are knowledge workers as well. Knowledge workers, as you here at Google know, we own our means of production. If we leave and we don't come back the next day or check in the next day or the next week, we've taken our means of production with us, and with that, a lot of valuable information. A lot of our knowledge work isn't tied to a specific location. That's the beauty of the whole thing, especially when you have a beautiful campus like you do. You can work almost anywhere. And knowledge workers, especially people coming into the workforce now, have very, very different and widely diverging expectations about how to work. And here's some typical knowledge workers throughout the ages. And it was very hard to get the picture of the early knowledge workers, I should just add, because they were not commonly referred to as knowledge workers at the time, of course. So what do knowledge workers do? Number one, not a big surprise, they search. People are constantly searching for things. Most of the time, as we know, they don't find things. There's an oft-cited stat that 50% of all searches fail. I'd be interested actually to hear any thoughts, from the Google point of view in general, because this is a very, very general overall, statistic relating to corporate search and all sorts of search. But we found that 50% of the searches people think succeeded in some, 50% of the searches people think succeeded actually failed. And they don't realize it. So what happens is they use the result, the answer. Again, it's somewhat problematic. I'm hoping that somewhere here, I'm sure people are working on more natural language search, because we like to actually get into a question and actually get an answer or several answer type of environment, ultimately to move away from 564,000 search results. But if you use stuff that comes out of the search where it's not the right thing, it's not the best information, you don't realize it's the old thing, or of course the fact that any clever 14-year-old can create his own website and it's really sometimes hard to tell the difference between that and, a well-established site. You may end up using the wrong information. Now, knowledge workers spend a lot of time creating, a lot of time, as I mentioned before, recreating when you can't find stuff because somebody put, the very important document in, Content Management System 33, and you didn't know that 33 existed. You didn't even know your organization had 97 content management systems. Just thinking about that number is just mind-boggling. You recreate it. Now, recreating can be actually a very time-intensive thing because you form a team or an ad hoc team. People spend lots of time reinventing the wheel and doing what somebody 6 months ago or 3 months ago already did, and never the twain shall meet. We spend a lot of time communicating, and we spend a lot of time sharing information, networking. Now, this is a chart with our stats. It ran in the Times about 2 years ago, and it's been updated since. But I'm showing you this not because it's old and obsolete, but because one key number changed dramatically. The last figure. Knowledge workers, by and large, think for a living. We reflect, we think. That's what I think we're supposed to be doing. According to the stats we came up with a few years ago, we found that by the end of the day, after everything that's spent, in the day, we have 12% left. Well, I'm sorry to say I was wrong. 12% was wildly optimistic. When we redid the study and we used a larger group and we refined our questions, we found out that at the end of the day, 5% of the day is left for thought and reflection. Now, that's not very much. Now, if I recall correctly, Google has a certain percentage of time you can use for special projects and things. Am I getting that correct? So that, of course, can be used, for the thought and reflection on whatever your current project or special project might be. But if you don't have that, if you only have 5% of your day by the time you're just so oppressed by everything else, well, it sort of doesn't, really matter anymore. So managing knowledge worker, and all that, those are huge challenges. I'm going to skip a drop about productivity for a minute and go straight into information overload. Now, my book, Overload, How Too Much Information is Hazardous to Your Organization, is the culmination of research, as I mentioned, that I've been doing for the past 15 years. I'd also like, before I say anything else about the book, to mention that the book actually does not end on the last page by design. We created a website, overloadstories.com, to continue the book and allow knowledge workers to put their own stories about information overload. Now, there are probably 40 or 50 stories already in the book from people about their travails with information overload, but we put the site up so that I can continue to post new research and new ideas, and as well, we can have readers or potential readers or friends or whoever put their own stories and talk about either how they solved the problem relative to information overload, or in some cases, if you go there, as you'll see, how information overload is killing them and just stopping them from being able to finishing their work. So I have a little definition for overload. I just say it's, information overload is too much of a good thing because information is good. Too much information can just be oppressive. But essentially, it's an excess of information that has some pretty dramatic impact on how we work. It stops us from being able to sometimes make decisions. It stops us from processing information, and it stops us from prioritizing tasks. It results in incapacitation many times. It's a challenge. Look at the causes of information overload for a moment. We've dramatically, both in terms of human and machine content creation, we've increased our ability to generate content. We've increased the number of modalities that we have available for content to hit us, but also to create the content. There's, of course, email overload, which is something that seems to be the poster child for many people for information overload, although in many cases, probably more than 50%, email overload is not the key problem for information overload. It just seems to be something that's the low-hanging fruit. Interruptions in general, when I say that, I'm referring to the way we have set up our technology that allows us to have it interrupt us, whether it's incoming email alerts, instant messages, phone calls, and other things that are inopportune. There's, of course, the fact that we have ubiquitous connectivity, which we generally think of as a good thing, but sometimes it would be nice to go away to a mountain where there is nothing. And there's lots of contradictory information out there, which weeding through it makes it very difficult. And hopefully, again, that people here at Google are working on solving that problem. So I'm not going to go into too much depth on this because I'm sure you know and feel this, but email is again, poster child and many times, a huge challenge for all of us. We have too much email and people tend to abuse it. I'll get into some stats in a few minutes about what happens when you do abuse it. Search, I'm not even going to go down that road. I think you could educate me much better than I can educate you. Schedule, meeting overload. I'm sure there's some empathy here for that. Unnecessary interruptions. We found that in some cases as much as 28% of the knowledge workers' day is consumed by these. One of the most interesting things that came out of my research, though, and this is why interruptions tends to be something I come back to frequently, is the fact that interruptions don't occur in isolation. Interruptions come with a penalty. I found this about 7 or 8 years ago, and I named it recovery time. Recovery time is the time it takes you to get back to where you were before you had the interruption. Now, the amount of recovery time is significant. It's 10 to 20 times the amount of the interruption in general. So that means I could interrupt you, or something, or someone, or some technology could interrupt you, break your thought, which really is, a distraction, and it'll, even if it's only 30 seconds, it'll take 5 minutes for you to get back to where you were. Now, you don't feel this. You don't sit back and say, oh, well, I have my interruption now. Okay, recovery time's starting. Good. Okay. Yes. Now, that's not really how it works. It's very insidious. You don't feel it. In the book, I refer to it as death by 1,000 paper cuts. And I think that's just, how you feel at the end of the day, that you've just been cut away. And actually, I'm just realizing this slide is out of date. There's 78.6 million knowledge workers in the U.S. So I guess I have to update my own slide. Another thing that really contributes to information overload is our view of how things are urgent and important. It seems that everything everyone does today is both urgent and important at the same time. Now that's a deadly combination. When you have somebody sending you an email and that person believes that what he is doing is much more important than what you're doing, it's urgent, important. He doesn't hesitate to contact you 2 minutes after sending an email saying, I see people smiling at this point, did you get my email? You get a text or phone call, or maybe both. Now, a lot of that, and that's not to blame any particular generation or anything, but I've noticed the trend that younger generation coming into the workforce tend to feel more entitled, and we have a society that since 1973 has been steeped in instant gratification. Anyone want to take a guess what happened in 1973 that dramatically changed the landscape for all of us when you absolutely positively had to get something somewhere overnight? Okay, big clue, a few people recognize. Yes, Fred Smith created FedEx. Before 1973, if you wanted something absolutely positively overnight, well, you had to drive it there. Now, today, think about it. You order something, and if it's not on your desk by 10:30 the next morning, you're on the web tracking where the truck is. We get a little bit obsessive. Okay, wait, he's turning left. He'll be here now. It's a little bit obsessive. And we take this attitude and we bring it into our expectations and how we work. Again, especially if you think about in the last 15 years, a lot of people have been brought up with the "you're very special, Mr. Rogers" kind of attitude. You get awards for your team coming in last or even behind last, if there's such a thing. So you understand why a lot of people just don't really put this into perspective, and they just don't understand that you're doing something important to you, and they have to balance this. There was a very good article in CIO magazine 2 years ago where a 21-year-old intern wrote something along the lines of, "Don't give me your tired old apps and applications. I want new, exciting, streamlined apps. If you don't give them to me, I'll leave and find another company that does." Now, first, I don't think she has any clue that in a large company it takes more than a minute or two to change over your implementation of whatever it is you have, maybe 4 or 5 years for an SAP implementation, who knows. But second, I don't think she had any idea of what the unemployment rate for people 21 out of college might be. I think it's like 35-40%. So if she's going to leave, she's not going to get enterprise apps. She's going to just get, unemployment. But that really is a perspective that people bring to this, and it's something that I don't think it's anyone's fault. I think it's just a question of we have to be able to understand this is why people burst in and interrupt us, because what I'm doing just isn't really important, and what the other person is doing in that person's mind is. So I mentioned technology-based interruptions as well. I'm just not going to really go down too much that. Cognitive overload. At the end of the day, we're just feeling it. I mean, there's just so much out there, and we just feel our brains shutting down. Same thing for tasks. I wanted to show you this chart. I actually made it 5 years ago, and since the chart is off the chart already, I didn't really feel the need to update it. But you can just see, if you go historically from the original tablet to the point of the current tablet technology, how much, relatively speaking, our pace of information creation, which I wrote the pace of information overload, has just dramatically increased. When you think of the fact that we have better tools, but not necessarily tools that can really address that type of geometric proportional increase, it's scary. Oft quoted, that's why I don't attribute this to anyone, more information has been produced in the past 25 years than in the past 5 centuries. But it's not a new problem. In 1545, Conrad Gessner warned of a confusing and harmful abundance of books. He wasn't alone, because in 1685, Adrien Baillet had fear of the multitude of books which grows in a prodigious fashion every day. Now, the cost of all this, we figured that information overload cost the U.S. economy $997 billion in 2010. And I'm probably being conservative. I hate to say it, but I'm probably being conservative. I know I've been going at a fast pace. I just want to stop and make sure if there are any questions that, we address anything. Okay. Come on, computer. Yay. Wanted to mention how much reading 100 email messages can take away from someone's day. When we've surveyed people and studied over their shoulder how they work, by the time, on average, and this was, I think, we studied 100 people, and again, when you're doing this type of work, you can't. We don't have, no one has the resources to watch thousands and tens of thousands of people, but we think it's a representative grouping. You can spend half a day on 100 emails. And the typical amount, I believe we calculated, the average amount of incoming email is 93. So we're pretty close to what people get. This is what information overload does do to us. It lowers productivity. It lowers our ability to comprehend things. It lowers our concentration level. I wanted to mention an interesting study by a Swiss novelist, Rolf Dobelli, who maybe Cliff can get him in to speak some point if Rolf is here. I think he really do well as well. Rolf wrote a white paper on how our news addiction dulls our brain. Now, before I read Rolf, and I read Rolf's treatise in April, I had actually cut back on my news. I'll admit it, I was a news junkie. I was addicted to all sorts of news around the world, political, international, just everything. I could read, lots of newspapers on the web or on the tablet. I could absorb all this, and I didn't realize what all this crap was doing to me. And I decided to take a news holiday around February because I was traveling a lot, and I just said, I just can't deal with this. And I found that my ability to absorb more lengthy, intense, deeper information improved. I found myself more relaxed as well. I also found I wasn't reaching for the tablets. I need that news. And then in April, a colleague found this white paper that Dobelli wrote, and he demonstrated fairly scientifically how too much news simply removes our ability greatly to digest deeper tracts. And that's a huge challenge. If you think about it, all these tiny sound bites are just chipping away at our ability to comprehend things. So it's really a huge challenge for everyone. But if we understand it, we can do a lot to try and mitigate the problem and address it. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book, was because I felt that if we raise awareness about the problem and we get a dialogue going, and we actually put out what the costs are, both in terms of the human toll as well as the financial and emotional toll, maybe people will do things about it. For every 100 people who might be unnecessarily copied on an email. Thanks to the phenomenon of recovery time, which I mentioned earlier, we lose approximately 8 hours of time. Think of how many times you get an email where there might be 50 or 100 people who really, really didn't have to be on that email. And just imagine every time somebody replies, and we're all polite, we write, great, thanks, and we hit reply to all, just, to make sure that everybody sees how polite we are. And each one starts this little cycle of this recovery time interruption, and your brain stops, and your flow stops, and after all that, it's really easy to see where this goes. In research we did at the end of 2010, 66% of knowledge workers told us that they don't have time in the day to get all of their work done. That's not a surprise, but this one is. 94% of the same group told us that at some point in the day, they typically feel incapacitated and overwhelmed by information. That, 94%. That means 6% are taking a day off. I mean, I'm not quite sure what happened to the 6%. I wanted to discuss what a few companies are doing. In particular, I want to use two examples here. One, how many people here heard about Nielsen's reply to all experiment about a year and a half ago? On their Outlook client, they removed the reply to all button. They didn't remove the functionality, however. So the first round of emails had to do with, hey, they've taken away our reply to all. The second had to do with, here's the keystrokes you use to actually get reply to all. Now, just imagine how much time that wasted. And then the bad press, picked it up. And it was just a fiasco because what they really should have done, at least from my perspective in UI design, is they should have just separated the buttons if they were really worried, because make the knowledge worker, make the user, make a conscious thought. Do I want to hit reply to all the way on the right, or do I want to just hit reply on the left? That would have been my easy example of what to do. I'm sure there are other things that we could come up with as well, especially, if you are CCing a lot of people, a little warning box comes up and says, oh, did you really want to CC 2,468 people? You sure about that? Things like that. On the other hand, I got a wonderful example from the U.S. Air Force, from a CIO there, Peter Marksteiner, about a really great technique he uses, because a lot of people don't read, no surprise, I'm sure, most of the text of an email. We found that people on average make it through the second paragraph barely. So if you have the really important stuff in the third paragraph or the fourth paragraph, how many times do you send an email and the person is asking you a question about what's in the fourth paragraph? It's already been covered. So you have emails back and forth, and it's like, you have to answer the question, but it was originally there. So what Colonel Marksteiner does, and the great thing about being in the military, is that he can actually order people to do this. It's like, it's not like you have a real choice. You're like, you will do this. He uses a system which he didn't invent, but he discovered, called BLUF. If I had a chalkboard here, I'd write it, but BLUF, bottom line up front. And what he would do is basically give a preamble to his email saying, I'm going to cover A, B, C, and D. So he put the person on notice saying, I'm covering multiple topics, and these are the topics I'm going to cover. Now, I tried doing that, but unfortunately everybody would email me back and say, what's BLUF? As opposed to actually addressing the email, which shows, but then I started saying, okay, if I don't use the word BLUF, but I follow the concept, I just write, dear Sam and John and Peter and Mary and Alice, I'm going to cover these 5 topics in this email, A, B, C, D, and E. I found that people actually paid more attention to what was in the email as opposed to ignoring, stuff. I do try to keep my emails to one subject whenever possible, but I just wanted to mention this because according to Mark Steiner, I think he said there must be at least 10,000 people now using this in the Air Force, and he gets a tremendous amount of positive feedback. It may not be for everyone, and clearly we're not in organizations where we can order people to do this, but if you actually set a little preamble out without using BLUF, based on my experience, you don't really need the back and forth saying what's BLUF. It may work. Now, I wanted to share this email with you. This is from Marsh & McLennan, which is a large company in the insurance field. Anybody want to guess? And these people own the 2 field. It's not the CC or BCC field. I just want to, and by the way, on average, 5 emails like this per day went out. Anybody want to guess how many people are in the 2 field here? We gave this to an intern to count. That's what interns are for? Sorry if there are any in the room. There's 5,000 people in the 2 field. And this was a very typical email that people at Marsh would send out saying, hey, does anybody know anybody at this company? It was called an all-hands, it even had a name, it was called an all-hands email. And that was a huge challenge because they would get all these, and of course, what happens? Somebody hits reply to all 5,000, and says, no, sorry, I don't. And then, of course, somebody else hits reply to all saying, take me off this list. Things like that. Does that sound familiar? There was a meltdown, actually. Colonel Mark Steiner told me about this great email meltdown at Maxwell Air Force Base, where he was attending a conference with some really big brass, the generals with the stripes and all that. And when you go into a secure briefing room, you have to leave your smartphone behind. And while they were in this briefing on the threat from Russia and China and all that, really high-level information warfare stuff, somebody, a clerk at Maxwell Air Force Base, sent out this little email about some sort of bunco card game or something like that, and she accidentally sent it to 2 bases. So there's about 50,000 people on the total mailing list. Of course, everybody hit reply to all. Some people commented. Some people said, take me off this goddamn list and things like that. And by the time all the big brass got out of the meeting, they turned their smartphones back on, and there was no email. That while they were discussing this huge threat from China or Russia, wherever the threat is maybe coming from, this little email about a bunco card game completely brought down the Air Force base. 2 bases, actually. So it's really interesting to see what can happen. I've been sort of giving tips a little bit, which here may be preaching to the choir, but I do tell people to read what people send you and to read what you send. I get so many emails where clearly the person just hasn't read anything of what they put in the email and it makes no sense. And I really try to practice what I preach and read what I'm about to send someone. I try and have some degree of empathy for people. I try to use a variety of search tools. I try to use arguments in my search. Again, I'm at Google. You guys know this way better than I do. And I try to do little things like I keep my instant message status updated and stuff like that. I did want to share a couple of things. Some really interesting things from the surveys that we do where people tell us how they remain focused. Obvious things like headphones, those are pretty easy. I like the people who take laptops and hide somewhere. One person talked about going to the conference room, turning the lights off, drawing the curtains, and actually sitting under the conference room table. Somebody else talked about going to cafes and Starbucks across town so nobody would know them. And then they were able to get work done. But I really like the guy who turns grumpy to the point of, where no one will actually talk to them until he's finished. I mean, that's just, get away from me. That'll just turn, get people to leave you alone, right? It's stuff like that. So this is a little logo we created. Information Overload Awareness Day is October 18th this year. We hope that you'll commemorate that day with us. We're going to actually it's the 3rd time we're celebrating Information Overload Awareness Day. The last 2 events we did were online this year. We're planning on doing an event both in person and online, details to be announced, but it's we'll bring a variety of people to just discuss the problem and to discuss solutions of what can be done. And with that, I'd really invite you to share your stories on overloadstories.com, hoping you have some good stories to talk about the problem of information overload that may help other people, and to also read what other people have already contributed. And I'd like to thank Cliff for inviting me. This is really, coming to a place where information is so important to people here and to the business and to the future of society. I feel very, very privileged to be here talking about what I've done about information overload compared to what you all are doing. So thank you very much for having me, and if there are any questions, I'm here for a while. So thank you.
A question. So I gather that you don't like reply to all.
Oh, no,
Yeah.
I think it's useful for certain purposes. I don't
Okay.
like when people don't realize they're replying to all to 5,000 of their closest colleagues without realizing it,
Right.
and just saying great thanks.
Okay.
There are nuanced levels
was-
of doing this here. I'm not against reply to all.
Okay. I was going to make the argument for it, that if you ask a question and everybody replies individually, then they all reproduce each other's work because they don't know the question's already been answered. So given that trade-off, do you have any specific rules for how people can fix it, or just hopefully people will be intelligent about it?
I have some idea. I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry. I have some ideas. I think it's a question of reading what people are asking, and there are certain emails where I say, please reply to me individually because it's not important for the group to see the answer. On other cases, it's very important, and I emphasize please reply to all because I think it's very important for the group to see everything. But the problem is that in, I'd say, more cases than not, it's not necessarily important, and especially when you CC people unnecessarily to begin with. I'd say the CC problem is worse than the reply to all problem. If we probably wouldn't be having this question come up if people kept the right number of people and didn't tend to overly CYA their emails unnecessarily. So it's not necessarily about the reply to all, but when you over CC people on an email, reply to all can sometimes become dangerous, as the Air Force example gives us. But I'm not against it at all. I use it all the time. I just use it in the right place where I think it's appropriate.
Thanks.
No, thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
I work in internal communications, and so we're super cognizant of not sending emails that aren't important. But we have a proliferation of modalities, and I saw that go by on one of the slides, and I'd be really interested in your thoughts about how other organizations have handled what information has to go to everyone in the company, what information is just informational and need to know. How do you separate out what's going on in a building versus HR things? We have just multiple kinds of information and multiple modalities, and we're sorting it out. I wonder if you had any thoughts to share.
It's a huge challenge, and I'd be happy to give you the longer answer after, so I don't,
Sure.
But the short answer...
They won't be bored because they get a lot of emails from us.
the short answer, or the medium answer, is basically it's a very tough question, and it's a question of fine-tuning to your audience. I'll give you an example. I had a conversation with Jim O'Donnell, who's the CEO of BMW of North America. And we were talking at this was at a cocktail party, and he said, "Oh yeah, information overload. I had somebody print out everything we sent to our dealerships, and it was so and so many feet every week of communication." Now I had never thought until Jim mentioned this of measuring information overload by feet. I thought that was a great idea. I said, "Jim, this is brilliant. I've never measured how many feet or yards or meters information overload could be." And he said, "Yeah, we had I think he said 7 feet or something." And he said, "No, and this is paper, printed, vertically stacked. No one could digest, no one in a dealership or anywhere, no human could digest all of this information." So he said, we have to figure out something to figure out whom to get the information to and via what modality and what has to be pushed versus what has to be pulled. And I'm using that as an example because, it's a different type of problem, but it's a very similar problem at the same time. It shows that you really have to think of your audience and understand and then develop strategies to not necessarily put everything in front of someone's nose as opposed to just making it available and hoping, but you can't just have things where you hope somebody will know. I mean, that gets into the urgent and important thing as well. I think the key thing here is that we've lost our ability to understand urgent, important, and all that. And until we regain that balance, that Gleichgewicht in German, the sense of balance that keeps us from going crazy, it's going to be a very difficult challenge in corporate communications and also external communications. People who have to communicate massive amounts of information about products, technologies, services, the government. There's everything. There's just so much you have to figure out. And nobody does it. You're never going to satisfy the audience. I think you have to recognize that from the beginning. No matter what, you're never going to get 100% satisfaction from your audience. But you may find better ways, especially by going and polling your audience, by giving choices. And I would conclude my answer, which is actually more long-winded than I thought it would be, by trying to develop multiple modalities so that each person could actually choose how he or she wants to receive information. So that, I always use the example, one person's junk mail is another person's LL Bean catalog. It's, if you don't care about LL Bean and you don't want the boots, you're not really going to be happy that the catalog came. However, if you like LL Bean, you're going to be like, oh great, I just needed to order something and the catalog came, or I got an email from them or something like that. So it's really a question of perspective. But I'd say that the ability to give people a choice, and again, I'm happy to talk to you more about this after and share some of our research that looks at this in and more even what Jim O'Donnell said, but it's a matter of choice, giving people choice. I know you had a question. It was answered. Okay. Groovy.
I'll wrap up with a final question then. So first of all, thank you for coming. We have a lot of GTD acolytes here that believe in getting things done, and so we really believe in that technique. But I wanted to go back to your question on the difference between urgent and important, and that issue seems like a cultural one that you can't really solve by sending out an email about what people should consider as urgent and important. So how have organizations tackled this and basically made people aware of conflicting priorities that are not within their own window, that other people are working on important things too?
Well, one of the things I've recommended to people in terms of getting the question of urgent versus important across, and it is a very, very tricky question, and it is cultural, generational, educational, there are lots of things that come up in this, is basically to put it all out on the table, to give people an opportunity to have a discussion, and to make, within work groups in particular, I think it actually is more pertinent in smaller groups than on large organizational charts, to make it clear, especially if you start to see a problem crop up, that there are way too many urgent and important requests, and that not everything, because I would say, if anything, close to 80% of what people tend to believe they're doing is urgent and important at the same time, is really to put this into perspective. If a manager within a work group can have a dialogue that establishes a protocol and brings people into thinking about it. Again, raising even the topic, because people are blithely unaware that this is a problem to begin with. It's not as if people do this deliberately. There's no design here. It's more a question of it's a lack of awareness. And just like with information overload, I know from what we've done when we've talked to large corporations, we know that just simply raising a few facts about information overload, some of the facts I've covered here, tends to actually bring down the incidence of information overload by 10 to 15%. It's not a technology problem. In fact, I should have said this earlier. I don't see information overload as today as a technology problem, nor do I see a lot of the solutions as being technology-based now. I think that there are future things that can be solved by technology, but ultimately I think that what we're really after is raising awareness so we understand it's a very, very human problem. It goes to core human frailties, and if we're able to address those, I think then we have a much greater likelihood of being able to lower the overall incidence of information overload and restore what really we've decimated in the work-life balance, bring some time back both for us personally as well as some productivity to the workplace, and I think we'll all be just happier, more relaxed, and more chill at the end of the day. So that's really it.
All right. Well, thank you very much for speaking with us today. It was an amazing speech.
Cliff, thank you so much for having me and inviting me here. It's truly an honor.